Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
I can see the Statue of Liberty already. Very small, of course.
I'm the king of the world!
You look terrible. I want you to eat. I want you to rest well, and a month from now, this Hollywood big shot's gonna give you what you want.
It's too late. They start shooting in a week.
I'm gonna make him an offer he can't refuse.
What is the relevance of each of these lines of dialogue? These are some of the most famous lines of all time due to their catchiness, their appeal, and their simplicity, but at the same time, each of these lines add so much to their respective stories. The first one is delivered in a Cold War satire, which has now become both one of the funniest and most alarming movies ever made. The second is uttered by a character who has nothing but excitement, and in the moment, the rest of his life to look forward to. And the third might just be the greatest moment of character building efficiency in the history of cinema, and given the line that comes before it about family, establishing almost every value of The Godfather in a matter of seconds. Each of these moments help us to better understand the world that is presented to us and the characters who are interacting with said world. Obviously, film is a visual oral medium, and on this channel I have focused a lot on the visual beauty of film, so today let's take some time to analyze the oral efficacy of cinema and the necessity of sound design. Going back to these three iconic films from three revolutionary and in their own rights iconic directors, I would like to focus on one in particular, Mr. Stanley, no middle name, Kubrick. Throughout his 13-film body of work, which spans 48 years and contains some of the greatest films ever made, Kubrick has always enacted irony, using films to make fun of the menial aspects and paradoxical nature of life. One of the best examples of this satirization is Dr. Strangelove, but for today I would like to focus on another one of Kubrick's funniest, but simultaneously one of the most twisted movies of all time, A Clockwork Orange. A Clockwork Orange is the 1971 film adaptation of Anthony Burgess's acclaimed novel of the same name. For a real quick summary, the plot follows a sociopathic 15-year-old who is heavily shaped by the dystopian environment he resides in. The narrative is presented in three distinct acts, each of which furthering the thematic elements of the film. The first delves deep into Alex's life as the leader of a street gang and his eventual downfall. The second act follows our sociopathic protagonist's stint in prison after he is betrayed by his jukes. This is also where the Ludovico treatment, a method of stripping away all urges of violent and otherwise undesired thoughts, is introduced. Undergoing this treatment, Alex is labeled cured and released. The final act follows Alex as he returns to society and is forced to recompense for his actions in the first act. The cyclical narrative of A Clockwork Orange allows for the film to explore deep themes of intellectual and mental isolation while also furthering the demented state that Alex is introduced to us in the same demented state that he leaves us with. Two thematic elements enhanced by the sound design of the film. So with all of that exposition out the way, let's go ahead and get into the verbal linguistics. Before we get into the dialogue verbatim, I think it is really important that we talk about this guy and the dystopia that he created.
I heard talk in the 1960s of the possibility of getting these young thugs and not putting them in jail, because jails were needed for professional criminals, but rather putting them through a course of conditioning, turning them in effect into clockwork oranges. No longer organisms full of sweetness and colour and light like oranges, but machines. I feared this, and that's why I wrote the novel. I feared the possibility that the state was all too ready to start taking over our brains and turning us into good little citizens without the power of choice.
Heavily inspired by Huxley's Brave New World and the prospect of an overextension of government control, Burgess began to write A Clockwork Orange out of fear. During this process, the skilled linguist created a language called NASDAQ, which in actuality is more of a street slang that combines British English and Russian.
What's it going to be then, eh? There was me, that is Alex, and my three droogs, that is Pete, Georgie, and Dim. Dim being really dim. And we sat in the Korova milk bar and making up our orthodox what to do with the evening. Our pockets were full of deng, so there was no real need from the point of view of crasting any more Pretty Polly to toll-chop some old Beck in an alley and vid him swim in his blood while we counted the takings and divided by 4.
This dialect is the one used by Alex throughout Stanley Kubrick's adaptation of the film, and it is by means of Alex's dialogue that Stanley Kubrick presents Alex as more intelligent than his counterparts while also displaying his adolescence. Despite Alex's horrendous actions, his use of this hybrid language tells us that he is more civilized than his counterparts, distinguishing him from the rest of the dystopian society. This extremely distinct dialect allows for the film to portray to us that this guy is cultured. He has an appreciation for language and knowledge. In particular, his style of rhetoric draws a distinction between him and his fellow droogs, conveying Alex's toxic masculinity and more prominently his desire for power and the acquisition of said power. While Dim, one of his fellow droogs, struggles to formulate a single sentence.
I don't like you should do what you've done.
Alex combines separate languages to show his intellectual superiority and in turn, his masculinity.
Watch that. Do watch that, old Dim, if to continue to be online thou dost wish.
Oh, globby bottle of cheap, stinking chip oil! Come and get one in the yarbles! If you have any yarbles, you eunuch jelly thou!
The repetition of these cynical phrases throughout the first act of the film certainly furthers Alex's sociopathy and distances the audience from the violent acts portrayed on screen. However, as actor Paul Scheer and film critic Amy Nicholson argue on their podcast Unspooled, these two phrases make the acts which are being referred to, extreme violence, murder, and rape, seem normal in context of the film. And while some may argue that verbalization is a product of its time, I simply respond by saying this: no, you're wrong. You want to know why? Because this film is rated X and contains plenty of nudity throughout it. Rather, I would argue that the use of these words highlights the normalcy of these acts to Alex, his droogs, and the other gangs in the futuristic society, and it also depicts Alex's adolescence in many ways. While Alex is attitudinized by his dialect, his use of some words such as munchy wunching definitely highlights the fact that this is a 15-year-old boy. And while he definitely seems intelligent around his peers, Alex's intellect is rendered useless outside of his small friend group. As conveyed in the interrogation scene, the world in which Alex lives disregards simple organizational concepts such as the law.
It's no good sitting there in hope, my little brothers. I won't say a single solitary slogan unless I have my lawyer here. I know the law, you bastards.
Righty right, Tom. We'll have to show our little friend Alex here that we know the law too. But that knowing the law isn't everything.
This dialogue also highlights the stark divide between the young and the old in this society. This is a fact that is furthered by his confrontation with his post-correction officer, Mr. Deltoid, who asks him,
"What gets into all? We study the problem. We've been studying it for damn well near a century, yes, but we get no farther with our studies. You've got a good home here, good loving parents. You've got not too bad of a brain. Is it some devil that crawls inside of you?"
Clearly, there's an ideological shift between Alex's and Mr. Deltoid's generations, as Mr. Deltoid is incapable of realizing the faults of the dystopian society they reside in and the impacts it has on Alex. Alex doesn't go to school and rather roams the streets at night, causing mayhem due to the lack of authority in his life. Many of the adults in the film assume that Alex's misbehavior is something that can easily be fixed or exorcised, like a demon, hence the Ludovico treatment, which is essentially the embodiment of opting not to understand what the root cause of the issue is. Overall, that's the reason why Burgers wrote the novel in the first place. He feared that the government wasn't attempting to understand the issues anymore, but rather change the people causing the issues by any means necessary. As he stated, he feared the possibility that the state was all too ready to take over our brains, turning us into compliant machines and taking away our individuality. As aforementioned, that is the very embodiment of the Ludovico treatment, which dehumanizes Alex to the point where he attempts suicide just to escape the suffering. Consequently, in both of these mediums, this concept goes back to the overall theme of the society versus the individual and begs the question of, is it better to force someone into compliance or allow for them to freely destruct? Which is more important, freedom or peace? And is it possible to have both at the same time? Now, these are not questions that I intend on answering right now because I neither have the brain power nor the inclination to do so, but any answer that I come up with will not just be disputed by you guys, but probably myself too. Now, on the other hand, I do think that Kubrick is giving us an answer to these questions, and that is a big, resounding no. You can't have both simultaneously, and in fact, these are two opposing concepts, just as the dialogue presents Alex as an inherently split but obviously wicked being. Now that we've got the verbal linguistics out the way, I think that what this video essay needs is the perfect ending. A bit of the old Ludwig van. As aforementioned numerous times, and this is probably not the last, actually this is definitely not the last time, film, guess what, is a visual oral medium. In the second half of that world, oral speaks to how big of a role the sound design plays in sending a message in movies. In cinema, sound intensifies the inner thoughts of a character, highlighting their psychological stability and their emotions. Throughout all of Kubrick's films, sound plays such a substantial role in portraying all of these ever so present tonal dichotomies. I mean, this is the guy that first worked with Alex North to create the opening of 2001: A Space Odyssey. I mean, just listen to this. Let's go ahead and play the clip. Relish in the genius of this. Now, while that is pure genius, I don't think that any of his scores use music to the psychological and allegorical extent as done in A Clockwork Orange. The dichotomous nature of Alex's character is highlighted by the stark differences in Wendy Carlos's score and Alex's love for Beethoven. Just as the title suggests, Beethoven's music is much more luministic and humane, taking the role of the orange in the title. However, Carlos's score is much more mechanical, like Clockwork. In conjunction with his dialogue, the juxtaposition of these two reveal key aspects of the twisted genius of Alex DeLarge. As stated, the differentiating tones of Wendy Carlos's mechanical score and Beethoven's Ninth Symphony present the unnerving dichotomy of Alex's character. The former is associated with the more barbaric and psychopathic actions of the main character, while the latter symbolizes Alex's humanistic and quite outright sympathetic qualities. This is the establishing scene of the film, a shot that depicts Alex centered in the frame with the Kubrickian stare, the downward deranged look that most of Kubrick's main characters possess once going mad. This look is always filmed from a low-angle perspective to depict the twisted superiority of a character, and Kubrick's characters possess this stare once going completely mad, usually in the second or third acts of his films. However, Kubrick begins A Clockwork Orange with this deranged look to introduce Alex's sociopathic demeanor premiere, and the opening shot is accompanied by Wendy Carlos's funeral of Queen Mary to depict the mechanical and inhumane characteristics of Alex. Now, juxtapose that with this. Throughout the film, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is a recurrent motif that opposes the uncivilized manner of man, rather depicting the peak of human civilization and accompanying the thirst for knowledge that Alex's dialect indicated earlier. Alex is extremely fond of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony because he appreciates the good that is left in the world. As Roger Ebert states in his review for the film, a visual, and in this case oral impression is built up during the movie that Alex, and only Alex, is normal. Going back to the establishing shot, Kubrick begins with Alex centered in the frame with this stare to additionally convey that Alex is the only character aware of his misdeeds. Throughout the film, by way of the dialogue, narration, and the score, Alex voices his regret for his actions. However, no other characters in the film do so. In addition to his intellectual isolation, Alex is emotionally isolated in a world where pity and dismay are frowned upon. Nonetheless, Alex is overtly sociopathic in many aspects. Through the thematic montages that accompany Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, we are given a first-hand look at what Alex calls gorgeousness and gorgeosity made flesh. Alongside images of Dracula and explosions, a low-angle shot of a young girl in a white dress being hanged appears. This image displays the woman's undergarments and the snapping of her neck, epitomizing the crude sexual aggression Alex has towards the opposing gender. His fondness for Beethoven is paralleled, and quite frankly, it is intertwined with his addiction to sex and violence. That is why when he is no longer able to lust after women and commit crude acts of violence, he can no longer enjoy Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. As the film progresses, Alex is stripped of the very things that make him humane, the individuality which the score embodied through his love for Ludwig van Beethoven. And when faced with his stolen individuality, well, you know what happens. According to cultural historian Christopher Frayling, the speeding up and slowing down of film works to distance the viewer from what is happening, instead creating a heightened sense of awareness of the filmmaking process and giving us a distant glimpse into a character's psyche. Quite frankly, editing serves the purpose of illuminating the significance of a scene within a story, and in two scenes in particular in A Clockwork Orange, the editing embodies Alex's desires. The first scene displays Alex using violence to retaliate against his droogs after his authority is questioned. The second shows Alex fornicating with two women. Both of these scenes use alterations in frame speed. The first scene is slowed down and covers 90 seconds as Kubrick displays Alex's violent acts in a balletic manner. In the latter, Alex's 28-minute menage a trois is sped up to cover only 40 seconds of film. These changes in speed reveal Alex's values and insecurities as the slowed down, violent scene follows a questioning of his manhood, whereas the sped up sex scene follows a triumphant victory. When questioned about this choice, Kubrick commented, "The speeded up orgy sequence is a joke. That scene took about 28 minutes to shoot at 2 frames a second, but it only lasts 40 seconds in the film." He goes on to say, "Alex's fight with his droogs would have lasted about 14 seconds if it wasn't in slow motion. I wanted to slow it down to a lovely floating motion." Now it might seem like I've forgotten the point of this video essay, so let's go ahead and get into the oral. Alex's violent acts are accompanied by Rossini's La Gazza Ladra, or The Thieving Magpie, a balletic song that makes the scene all the more majestic and enjoyable. Now listen to this one. The combination of the William Tell overture with the sex scene makes it all the more comedic, highlighting the irony in Alex's values. Both scenes display Alex's joy and eagerness. However, his exploitation of women is much clearer in the second, and his childish craving for power is obvious in the first. I personally feel that very few directors have been able to use sound to the extent in which Kubrick has done it throughout his body of work. And of all of his films, I must say that A Clockwork Orange is probably the best. Obviously, Kubrick knows how to establish and create irony through his films, as this is the man that created this ending.
Mr. President, we must not allow a mine shaft gap.
Sir, I have a plan.
Monsieur has been walked.
Similarly, A Clockwork Orange uses the sound design to build a dystopia that feels so much closer than it should. Obviously, the visual aspects are often inseparable from the oral, as I have talked plenty about the visual beauty of A Clockwork Orange, a movie that has some of the greatest set design that this guy has ever seen. The sound design of the film is something that is often overlooked, and I wanted to take some time to focus on both the diegetic and non-diegetic aspects of this film, and how A Clockwork Orange uses the dialogue and score to create a sociopathic genius in Alex DeLarge. A 15-year-old genius who has created his own language, has an intellectual thirst for knowledge, and appreciates the complexities of society, while at the same time an adolescent gang leader who rapes, steals, kills, and lies his way to a cure just to return to his conniving ways. Simply put, A Clockwork Orange's sound design creates a twisted genius.
I'm singing in the rain, just singing in the rain. What a glorious feeling, I'm happy again. I'm laughing at clouds so dark up above. The sun's in my heart and I'm ready for love. Let the stormy clouds chase everyone from the place. Come on with the rain, I've a smile on my face. I'll walk down the lane with a happy refrain, just singing, singing in the rain. Dancing in the rain. I'm happy again.